Welcome to The New Paradigm for Mankind, a weekly discussion between Lyndon LaRouche and his scientific associates, in which we investigate the true nature of the creative human mind and the ideas necessary for the progress of mankind.
Welcome to today's show. Today is October 16th, 2013. My name is Megan Beets, and I'm here in the studio with Benjamin Deniston of the LaRouche PAC Scientific Research Team and Lyndon LaRouche. So for today's show, we're going to continue the discussion that we took up and began last week of energy flux density as the basis of a physical economic program and a physical economic recovery. But I do think, just to premise it, it's important to mention that in discussions yesterday, you, Mr. LaRouche, made clear that it now has come the time where Obama must be removed from office. And you are beginning to have a realization on the part of certain people in the institutions that you were absolutely right, that this administration's policy is a mass death policy, and it has been that from the beginning. And that's exactly what we're seeing being moved into place right now amidst the chaos in Washington, D.C. It's a policy of intentional genocide to kill off a majority of the American population, and as you put it, people have a death notice on their door. So to avoid that, the time has come to move this guy out. However, this is also coming as a very dramatic end phase of what's been a decades-long, 40-year policy of genocide globally and of downsizing the human population, of zero growth. And what we're going to take up today is a discussion of how do we physically overcome what has been the physically destructive and devastating effects of this policy and move forward to a policy of progress.
Yeah, so to get at that, it's going to go through basically, if we're going to have a global recovery, what's that going to look like? Like you just said, decades of a zero growth policy, and the world's just in horrible shape. Some of these figures of just global poverty are hard to even wrap your mind around, really. They just get thrown around like statistics. 1 billion people without electricity. 800 million people without access to clean water. That's twice the U.S. population. Twice the entire U.S. population without any access to clean water in the world. You look at the starvation, the hunger conditions. So there's a huge, and this has been, as you said, the intention of this Anglo-Dutch system. So if we can overthrow this Anglo-Dutch system and get a global program that's serious about giving human beings the condition that human dignity requires, if we're serious about giving mankind globally the living conditions that are required by the nature of humanity, of mankind, that is a serious effort. And I just kind of wanted to give a preliminary sense of, say, a 50-year program, a 50-year vision for what it would take to do this. And immediately, as we'll get into, when you take this 50-year perspective, that tells us today we have to immediately look at fusion as the critical factor, fusion power, and we immediately have to look across the Pacific as the region where you have a density of industry, pro-growth orientation that we can work with to make this program a reality in, say, 50 years. But the governing concept that we started from in looking at this is this concept of energy flux density per capita. The idea of how much, which literally you could translate to how much power does each individual represent in society. If you take the total population and you take the total energy throughput for that total population, you look at per capita, how much power is provided to each individual. Now, one thing is electricity, but also there's other forms of power. The fuel in your car is not in the form of electricity, it's your combusting petroleum, but that's another form of energy. You use coal for various industrial processes, steelmaking, various things. So if you look at the total amount of energy per capita, you get a sense of how much power does each individual express in the economy. And we've done some of these studies on the history of this in the United States, and this Lynn, you had an interesting point in one of your recent papers where you said that it's discrete shifts in energy flux density characterize human progress. It's not just some gradual process, but you have these discrete shifts from one power source to another power source, defining qualitative leaps in mankind's economy, as expressed here, for example, in this concept of the energy flux density per capita. And so this, we've used this graph a number of times. This is the history of the United States from its founding up to the present, divided by the power sources. So you have wood, the transition to coal, the transition to petroleum and natural gas. And with each of these successive transitions, you see a rough doubling of the power per capita. So population is growing, and power energy consumption is growing at a faster rate. So you actually have an overall per capita growth in energy consumption, energy flux density. And this has characterized the progress of the U.S. economy historically. And as we've discussed, with the 1970s, the beginning of the 1970s, the end of the 1960s, you had the ending of this growth process. The nuclear platform was not allowed to be implemented in full. Nuclear fusion was sabotaged and not allowed to be developed. And we've seen a flat line of the energy flux density per capita and the beginning of a collapse. So this has defined the physical collapse of the United States economy for the past 40 years. And you can see the arrow indicating what a continuation of a natural, healthy economic growth rate needs to be, versus what happened, creating this gap in the needed growth, which defines and characterizes our current economic crisis, our current collapse. So if here's another view of the same growth rate. This here is just looking at the 1949, 1950 up to today. And so what we looked at for this study to define what would be needed to support the world economy and having a United States recovery in terms of energy flux density is take a period of healthy, decent growth. Take this period from 1960 to 1970, for example. The United States was under, we had an economy driven by the Apollo program, a science driver program. We still had an industrial orientation. We still had an agricultural orientation. And you saw about a 30% growth in a decade of the energy flux density per capita. Now, if we would have continued that, that would have brought us today to about 30 kilowatts per capita. Kilowatts being the measure of power. We would have gone from the level then of around 10, just over 10, to 30. So we should be about 3 times above where we are today in terms of the power of each individual in the United States economy. Now, as a preliminary estimate, say we are going to take seriously the needs of mankind on this planet, and say we want to have a planet where every person on this planet has the quality of life that we should have today. Say, as a rough estimate, 30 kilowatts per capita figure. If we wanted to have a global economy where every individual has the ability to have a standard of living, productivity, quality of life that we should have in the United States today of 30, expressed by this 30 kilowatts per capita figure, what would it take to do that? And say we wanted to do it in a 50-year program, take 2 generations as a mission to do this. Start with the United States. This is, on the left, the purple graph is the same graph we just looked at if we would have continued the 1960s growth rate. If we would have continued the idea of roughly doubling the energy flux density per capita every generation. which would mean a natural doubling when we went to nuclear fission, and then another doubling with the introduction of thermonuclear fusion, which we could have had permeating the U.S. economy easily in the 2010, 2020s, 2030s. It could have begun to dominate the U.S. economy if we'd continued this trajectory then. On the orange curve is where we need to go today in terms of the growth needed for the U.S. economy, in terms of the energy flux density per capita. Again, from the present level of around 10, and say in 50 years, if in 50 years we want to have a full-scale thermonuclear fusion economy in the United States, continuing this idea of the historical rate of growth with these successive transitions to higher fuel sources, we'd be in somewhere in the range of this 60 to 70 kilowatts per capita figure. Now, one last thing here to come back. So then, if that's what we need to do in the United States, globally, if we're going to attempt to be serious about tackling this challenge, we're going to have to look at something like this. Globally, right now, take the entire world population currently, divide it by the total power consumption, power usage, you're at about a global average about 1/5 of what the United States is today. And the United States today is about 1/3 of what it should be. So you have a major challenge to deal with. So that's this curve on the right here, the lower curve, starting around 2.3 kilowatts per capita is the global average today. So say we take, just as a preliminary rough metric or goal, in 50 years, we want to get to something on the order of 30 kilowatts per capita globally for the world economy. That is going to be a major challenge requiring something. If you include population growth, and you're expecting a world of somewhere between 10 and 12 billion people in 50 years, to take the rough estimates of population growth, you're looking at something on the order of 360 terawatts of power. That's 360,000 gigawatts. The current level is 16. So we're talking about over a 20-fold increase in total power usage needed in order to be able to provide the necessary per capita power for a global economy to support a standard of living. Now the point is, this would translate into immediately thinking about tens of thousands of nuclear power plants, for example. Thinking about tens of thousands of fusion power plants in a generation or a little bit more. So the point is that these are the terms we have to start thinking in if we're going to be serious about what human dignity actually requires in terms of a standard of living, a quality of life on this planet. We need to be thinking in the terms of a 50-year program, thinking about literally tens of thousands of reactors, terawatts economy power. And then taking that as what mankind needs, what the global economy needs, and taking that back to today, that means we have to immediately follow, Lynn, as you emphasized on the show with the policy committee on Monday, to look across the Pacific as the orientation where you have a serious intention to progress and the industrial capacity to begin a serious global recovery program. And it has to begin from day one with this concept of fusion being the key driver. Because this sounds like a lot, but it's not anything but a continuation of the natural historical growth process that the U.S. economy itself illustrated. The transitions from coal to petroleum, or from wood to coal. And once you go to fusion, you're literally talking about the ocean being your fuel supply. You're not worried about digging out coal from somewhere or trying to even find uranium, which is, you know, not all that abundant necessarily. But you're at the point where ocean water becomes your fuel supply, and you're fully capable of achieving this level of growth, this quality of growth. So I just wanted to, because the problem I've seen just in some of the discussions, even with better intentioned people in the United States, is a tendency to undershoot the reality of what's needed. We need to be thinking, if we're serious about giving mankind what mankind needs and deserves on this planet, some of these values are approximations, but this is the order of magnitude that we should be thinking of in terms of a 50-year program to provide what's needed for a real global recovery and a real alternative to this Anglo-Dutch zero population death paradigm that's dominated the last 40 years. This is an expression of the alternative policy, the opposite direction, the contrary direction. And so one thing we're working on in the basement is taking this perspective and working back and defining what do we need then as a crash program for nuclear power, for nuclear fission, how quickly can we get nuclear fusion online, and how can we, from this 50-year perspective, work back to make this type of program a reality.
Well, that part you described is, I think, self-evident to anyone who understands and takes this seriously. The problem is the intellectual question. And we have to look at man not just as an animal, because mankind has a natural capability which does not correspond to any animal. So really talking about power in terms of physical power doesn't really answer the question. What drives mankind, what makes mankind be able to progress, is because of what we call creative powers. The actual creativity distinct from any measure, ordinary measure of energy, flux density. This is what the key factor is. Since we're dealing with a reductionist population largely, when you try to discuss things with a reductionist, a person who's an advocate of reductionism, they will immediately demand that everything comes down to physical quantities. And that's where the problem arises. It actually is what drives creativity. And creativity is not driven by a physical consideration. Rather, the physical consideration is driven by the intellectual one. And that's what has to be understood. And that's the fight we really have, because people say, let's be practical. When you see a person say, let's be practical, you know you've got a stupid person on your hands. No matter how clever they may be, they are not people who are creative. Because creativity involves we can look at this in terms of energy flux density of the human species as opposed to other species. The human species is the only species which does voluntarily increase the energy flux density. It doesn't always do that, but it's always capable of doing it. The history of mankind, surviving mankind, has always been dependent upon this. So that correlation has to be given. I think Riemann is very useful on this in particular. Also Max Planck and Einstein. I think these are model cases of people whose intellectual powers overshadows everything else about them. And you realize that that's the source of it. The human creativity, the noetic capability of the human mind is a real source.
Right.
That is what generates the ability to increase the energy flux density.
Well, Vernadsky had he had his work, Scientific Thought as a Geological Phenomenon.
Exactly.
A great expression that scientific thought itself has these physical effects. It's the source of these physical transitions.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And that's why he's so important. And because that's Kusa. That's Kusa's orientation to accuratia. And this is what the whole principle is. So if you want to put together, what's Shakespeare mean, for example? What's Shakespeare's drama mean? It's the best one, like King Henry V, which is the best one where that particular phenomenon comes up as the theme. And he never did it again in the same way. He did something similarly in later life, but he never did that same thing again. And that's what really is crucial, that the human mind is a physical force. Well, that's another way of putting it.
Right.
And therefore, the development of the human mind's capability, the noetic capability, is what the driver is. Without the driver, you don't get the physical improvement.
Right.
On the one hand, it looks like a capacity to absorb which are, when you're going to an educational program, for as a standpoint, then you say, well, this is the ability to absorb knowledge, which then is translated into an effect. But the real thing is that it's actually the noetic force is the physical force. Then that is what is not well understood. That's what he understood, Kepler understood. That's exactly what he understood. But it was what Coase also understood. And so therefore the most important thing, well, first of all, education. The criminal aspect of education is the fact that they have an idea of learn from the teacher. Now that's stupid, because if they don't prompt the student to become creative, you're going to fail. Your whole purpose is to make that student creative. Now, how do you do that? You have to challenge them to a creative act. What do? You take some problem, ask them to solve the problem. And if you get a class of, say, 20 or 30 people, 20 at best probably is even better, if you can get them to say, what do we do about this? What is the answer? What does this mean? That kind of. So it's the pedagogical method. It's where someone says, here's the lesson for today, memorize this. Crap, that destroys the student. You want to force them to experience something they had never known before, and have it pop out of their own mouths, or their own will. It's what we call creativity. And therefore, human voluntary creativity is the precondition for the development of physical productivity. Otherwise, without this, you can't absorb these technologies. You cannot understand them.
You know, Planck had a beautiful description of what you're talking about with the creative process. And he said that the most important tool of the scientist is the creative imagination. And the reason for that is that the imagination isn't limited by any of the boundaries that we encounter with our senses. But the imagination can roll along freely and invent things that have never been experienced and that could never be perceived. And the creative imagination can follow and play out the unfolding of processes. And then from there, you go back into the physically experienced world and look for evidence of these things.
You've got a very simple thing in terms of energy flux density, the history of energy flux density of the human species, which is unique. And the point is that creativity is actually something which is not deduced. It's induced, not deduced. It comes out, creativity becomes the hunger to get free of something which is stagnant.
Well, each really, truly revolutionary scientific discovery created something that was literally impossible from the previous framework. So what I get in what you're saying is, how do you train people to have their mind transcend an impossible? How do you condition people to think in a way of transcending an entire previous system and going into this realm of the imagination and coming up with a totally new, completely new idea? Now, if you replace that process with this memorization, with this repeat after me, this is the formula, this is the result of Kepler's work is these three laws. Now memorize these three laws, and now you know Kepler. You're destroying the mind. You're not giving...
Because you didn't give the student the experience of making the discovery of the principle. And it has to come from the student's mind, not from being indoctrinated. You have to inspire them, challenge them, see how far you can push their mind, ask them questions they can't answer, tease them, but you have to use legitimate questions, but you have to tease them, in a sense, by saying, what does this mean? What do you think that means? What do you think that means? That's what a good educational program is to challenge them and pose them with things which they have to use their imagination to understand. Without that, you don't have creativity. And without creativity, we don't have progress, because it's the ability of the human mind to grasp and, so we say, recognize a truth that they've never known before, and suddenly they recognize it. That's what any child does when they really make a discovery. They suddenly realize, this, oh, that's true, huh? This works, I understand it now. Huh? And it's that process which is crucial. And that is exactly how you make people stupid. You drill and grill. You have to stimulate these young people. And that it happens. You have to create an environment in which play, for example. You choose play for children. What kind of play do you want to have them give? You want them to have real play, play of the mind, making discoveries. Provoke them to make discoveries. What do you think that means? What do you think that animal is? These kinds of questions. And any good teacher, really competent teacher, will do that. They'll try to stimulate the student. And it's always this looking forward into the future which does that. It's inspiration. Everything in creativity is inspiration always. You get that from Planck and Einstein, for example. It's clear. The best work of Riemann is the same thing. No, it's getting people to become intoxicated with the idea of achievement. Being able to create something and to enjoy seeing it something happen as a result of it. It's our option.
And phase of what's been a decades-long, 40-year policy of genocide globally and of downsizing the human population, of zero growth. And what we're going to take up today is a discussion of how do we physically overcome what has been the physically destructive and devastating effects of this policy and move forward to a policy of progress.
Yeah, so to get at that, it's going to go through basically, if we're going to have a global recovery, what's that going to look like? Like you just said, decades of a zero growth policy, and the world's just in horrible shape. Some of these figures of just global poverty are hard to even wrap your mind around, really. They just get thrown around like statistics. 1 billion people without electricity, 800 million people without access to clean water. In perspective, that tells us today we have to immediately look at fusion as the critical factor, fusion power, and we immediately have to look across the Pacific as the region where you have a density of industry, pro-growth orientation that we can work with to make this program a reality in, say, 50 years. But the governing concept that we started from in looking at this is this concept of energy flux density per capita. The idea of how much, which literally you could translate to how much power does each individual represent in society. If you take the total population and you take the total energy throughput for that total population, you look at per capita, how much, that's twice the U.S. population, twice the entire U.S. population without any access to clean water in the world. You look at the starvation, the hunger conditions. So there's a huge, and this has been, as you said, the intention of this Anglo-Dutch system. So if we can overthrow this Anglo-Dutch system and get a global program that's serious about giving human beings the condition that human dignity requires, if we're serious about giving mankind globally the living conditions that are required by the nature of humanity, of mankind, that is a serious effort. And I just kind of wanted to give a preliminary sense of, say, a 50-year program, a 50-year vision for what it would take to do this. And immediately, as we'll get into, when you take this 50-year
Welcome to The New Paradigm for Mankind, a weekly discussion between Lyndon LaRouche and his scientific associates, in which we investigate the true nature of the creative human mind and the ideas necessary for the progress of mankind.
Welcome to today's show. Today is October 16th, 2013. My name is Megan Beets, and I'm here in the studio with Benjamin Deniston of the LaRouche PAC Scientific Research Team and Lyndon LaRouche. So for today's show, we're going to continue the discussion that we took up and began last week of energy flux density as the basis of a physical economic program and a physical economic recovery. But I do think, just to premise it, it's important to mention that in discussions yesterday, you, Mr. LaRouche, made clear that it now has come the time where Obama must be removed from office. And you are beginning to have a realization on the part of certain people in the institutions that you were absolutely right, that this administration's policy is a mass death policy, and it has been that from the beginning. And that's exactly what we're seeing being moved into place right now amidst the chaos in Washington, D.C. It's a policy of intentional genocide to kill off a majority of the American population, and as you put it, people have a death notice on their door. So to avoid that, the time has come to move this guy out. However, this is also coming as a very dramatic